change the route of our hike. And we ended up on the side of a 2-lane highway, about 5 miles from our car. So the plan was that my husband was going to hitchhike around and then come back for us. But as we stood there, car after car went by, and despite our waving, no one stopped. Now, I'm sure there are a myriad of reasons why people wouldn't stop. Surely some were a little afraid. I mean, my 3-year-old can be quite fierce. But mostly, I really understood that people don't like interruptions. I'm that way. Interruptions distract and delay, even completely derail our plans. And yet, interruptions are often where human need is revealed. I mean, my family's need would have been an interruption to anyone who would have stopped. But as I was thinking about this, I remembered a lesson I had learned long ago from a good friend of mine, Patricia Cat. She was the administrative assistant of the first church I served in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And she was one of the best role models of how to deal with interruptions. We used to talk at length about all the phone calls and the unexpected visitors that would distract her from her to-do list. And while the rest of us would experience increased anxiety as our workload kept piling, she would smile and say, "The interruptions are where the ministry is." The interruptions are where the ministry is. And isn't that true for Jesus? I mean, so much of Jesus' ministry happens in the interruptions. A paralytic who is lowered through a roof of a crowded house where Jesus is teaching. Or a man possessed with a demon who screams out in the middle of worship. Or the disciples' often abrupt questions. And even today, the story is one such interruption. We hear of Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, who comes to Jesus because his daughter is sick, nearing death, and he begs for Jesus to come and touch her, to heal her. And Jesus goes with him. Now, we don't know if Jesus had other plans, but he willingly changes it and goes wherever Jairus needs him to go. Now, we might think that Jesus goes so willingly because Jairus is a respected pillar of this town. But this is Jesus. Jesus goes so willingly because that's what Jesus does. But before Jesus can make it to Jairus' house, his daughter dies. And we read about people who come out to tell Jairus of his daughter's death, and they say to him, "Why trouble the teacher any further?" But when Jesus overhears this, he says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." Now, many of us can testify that faith or trust in God can alleviate or lessen some of our fears, but we all know that to be afraid is natural. It's human. And it's okay to be afraid when we're facing a challenge or a sickness or death or that of a loved one. It's okay to look at tragedy and terrorism and suffering in the world and to fear that persecution and prejudice and abuse of power will continue to be the agenda of the day. But when we look at Jesus' words closer, we see that fear is not what Jesus is admonishing. Instead, what Jesus wants is for our fear not to hold us back. Jesus doesn't want our fear to keep us from pushing through whatever crowd interrupted again. Someone touches him. Someone whose silence, whose pain, whose faith has pulled from him a life-giving power. And Jesus just needs to find out who it is. So Jesus looks around and says, "Hey, who touched me?" Of course, the disciples are sort of typically disbelieving and are like, "Jesus, do you see all these people? No one person touched you. A whole crowd of hands has touched you." But Jesus could tell that a particular power had left him, a power that was called out by someone. And there she is, a woman. And not just any woman, but a woman who has been suffering with a non-stop menstrual period for 12 years straight. And she has pushed her way through this crowd just to touch Jesus' cloak, and when she does, she is healed. Now, right away, we learn that this woman did not really want to interrupt Jesus. She would have rather have gone completely unnoticed. After all, she is afraid. She's afraid because unlike Jairus, who's this respected member of society, this woman was considered an outcast. Not only does the society of her time treat women as second-class citizens, but her illness would have meant she was ritually unclean. That meant that she wouldn't have been welcome in worship in the temple. She wouldn't have been welcome in the marketplace. She probably wasn't welcome at home because everything she touched was considered unclean too. No wonder she didn't want to interrupt Jesus. She didn't want to be caught in this shameful, embarrassing, and defiling act of touching him. But she is discovered, and Jesus doesn't send her away, doesn't call her unclean or unwelcome, but instead calls her daughter. And then he commends her, not for her fearlessness, but for the faith that she has that doesn't let her fear keep her from interrupting him. That's why in 2 verses later, when Jesus overhears Jairus' friends say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore," we hear Jesus say, "Wait, no, definitely bother me, interrupt me." That's what I hear when Jesus says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe. Believe that I am the one to come to. Believe that I have the power to heal. Believe that my love and grace and justice will prevail over all the pain and suffering in this world. Do not fear, only believe." And then Jesus goes on to Jairus' house, declaring that the child is not dead, but just sleeping, and he heals her. So too, Jesus says to us, whatever you are struggling with, whatever you are fighting, whatever you are facing, come to Jesus. He wants us to interrupt him, and God will give you the strength and the grace and the healing that you need. But the story doesn't end there. You see, after Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, he gives Jairus and the others present a job. I don't know if you caught it right there at the end. He says, "Give her something to eat." You know, as I was thinking about feeding, I was thinking about Charleston, the shootings that happened. As word spread about this tragedy, we mourned, and we raged, and we prayed, and we cried tears of sorrow and solidarity. But then, when the news cycle moves on to the next story, will we just forget? That's one of my fears, that we will continue to hear story after story of racism and other ills in our country, in our world, and we might pay a little attention for a while, but then we'll just move right back on to our privileged routines and forget. We need to be interrupted, not just every once in a while, but every single day. Interrupted by Jesus calling us to not let our fears keep us from facing the challenges. Interrupted by the people that society has pushed aside. Interrupted by the difficult but oh so important job of feeding our neighbors. That is honoring all of God's children, not as unworthy or unwelcome, but as daughters and sons. And sometimes that's as simple as the gracious locals of Marietta, New York, who let us interrupt their walk to drive my husband around to get our car there in the Adirondacks. And sometimes it's as complicated as forgiving and healing and walking in solidarity with the victims of violence and prejudice, but not just for a news cycle, but for a whole life cycle. Because once we have witnessed God's life-giving power, our job is to continue to give them something to eat. So this week, may you not fear, but believe that Jesus wants you to turn to Him with whatever you are struggling with. And may you feel the healing touch of Jesus in your life. And may you embrace the ministry of interruptions to offer love and grace and the justice of Jesus to someone that needs you.